There's an opportunity now here in Australia to revisit the issue of how to ban Hezbollah. Right now in Australia, only the military and terrorist wings of Hezbollah are banned, or prescribed, or designated. And that, to be perfectly honest, is silly. I don't mean to be the ugly American and come and tell a foreign country how to do things, but on this I feel quite comfortable, because you don't have to listen to Matt Levitt. The people who are most articulate about the fact that there is no distinction between the various wings of Hezbollah are Hezbollah officials themselves, who look at the European Union's parsing of wings, or New Zealand, or Australia, and they laugh. And it enables them to continue to do bad works under the cover of good works, muddying the waters because it does work. Raising money for terrorism and militancy through their construction company, through charities, through other things. This is a problem. And it's now suddenly pretty much an immediate problem, because the only time of the various different Hezbollah operations that we've seen over the past few years, Hezbollah is now more engaged in international terrorist activity than we have seen it since the late 1980s and early 1990s. And the only time they've succeeded was in Burgas, Bulgaria, using a 3-man team, 2 dual Lebanese Canadians and 1 dual Lebanese Australian. Meliad Farah, 32-year-old, preferred to go by the AKA Hussein, is now believed to be a fugitive somewhere in Lebanon. Now, don't feel too special. We've seen dual Lebanese Canadians and dual Lebanese Australians and dual Lebanese Swedes and Danes and Americans. One of the 5 Hezbollah operatives currently indicted by the UN's Special Tribunal for Lebanon in The Hague for the assassination of former Prime Minister Rafik Hariri, the man who purportedly planned and orchestrated the operation, an American passport holder. But in the United States, we've banned all of Hezbollah. And that, I think, is what has to happen now in the rest of the Western world. There are 2 distinct plot lines going on right now, separate and apart from the humanitarian disaster that is Syria. And they come back to the assassination of Imad Mughniyeh in February 2008, or at least that's what most people say they come back to. In fact, as you'll see, they don't. They predate this. February 2008, somebody assassinated Imad Mughniyeh, the head of the External Security Organization, the Islamic Jihad organization, the terrorist element of Hezbollah. At his funeral a couple of days later, the head of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, gets up at the funeral by video teleconference for fear that he'll be next on the target list and says, look, Israel, you want open war, I will give you open war. It's interesting. Among the declassified intelligence you'll find when you buy the book, which is probably the singular most important way to combat Hezbollah terrorism there is. We now know from declassified intelligence that's in the book that at the time that Hezbollah made this threat against Israel, they actually weren't quite convinced Israel had carried out the assassination. Actually, their primary suspect was the Syrians, which is very interesting given that Iran and Hezbollah are all in defense of the Assad regime right now. But be that as it may, they threatened the Israelis. The Israelis didn't have to wait very long. Later that year, the first of a series of operations targeting current or former Israeli officials. Mughniyeh was the prince of Hezbollah. The retaliation had to be at an equally senior level to be effective from their minds, targeting the Israeli ambassador in Baku, Azerbaijan. There have been about a dozen plots in Baku since then between Hezbollah and the Iran's Quds Force. Kidnapping and murder plots in West Africa, Southern Europe, Eastern Med, a whole series of things happen and fail and happen and fail. And I think that there's a reason for this. We know that after 9/11, and Hezbollah was not involved in 9/11. My final assignment at the FBI, I was the lead analyst for Flight 175, the second flight to the Trade Center. But Hezbollah, not involved, but saw 9/11, saw this, and they did not want to get caught in the crosshairs of this war on terrorism, did not want to get thrown into the same basket as Al-Qaeda. And while they withdrew not a single financier, logistician, procurement officer, or criminal supporter from their networks around the world, they did withdraw the small number of trigger pullers, people who could make things go boom in the night, because they did not want to get caught up in all that. They started doing other things, some things they'd already been doing. For example, infiltrating people into Israel through third countries, sometimes to carry out intelligence, sometimes to carry out bombing attacks. Hussein Maqdad went from Lebanon to Syria to Austria to Switzerland to Israel, and eventually blew himself up. He survived, lost several fingers and an eye in putting together his explosive in his East Jerusalem hotel room. But they also sent people into Israel to do these types of operations, not just through Europe, but through Southeast Asia. Zinal bin Talib, a Malaysian operative, made his way into Israel twice within a year, in 1999 and 2000. The Israelis found out about it, but not until after he made his second run through Israel. And we know that in 1999, when the Sunni head of one of Hezbollah's networks here in your backyard, Pandu Yudowinada, was arrested at the airport in Manila. He had on his person 5 fake passports he had just procured in the southern island of Mindanao for 5 Australians that he intended to infiltrate into Israel in an exactly parallel type of operation through Australia, because it would seem less suspicious if they were coming through Australia, a Western country, in front of Israel, than if they were coming through another country in the region. They continued these types of operations, but not things going boom in the night in the West, because they didn't want to get caught in the crosshairs of that war on terrorism. Then when Mughnir was assassinated and they wanted to avenge his death, frankly, those capabilities had rusted on the vine. So in mid-2009, they approached the Iranians and they said, look, we need a little more help than usual. And the Iranians say, of course, yes. And they provided them more support than usual for an operation in September 2009, targeting this time the Israeli Consul General in Istanbul, Turkey. And this too was foiled. You have this strange situation now where Iran and Hezbollah, which have been close partners for so many years, Iran created Hezbollah. They share a common theological foundation. Hezbollah believes in the idea of exporting the Iranian revolution. They're now arguing with each other. Iran is saying, Hezbollah, you guys used to be great, and now you kind of stink. It's embarrassing. And Hezbollah says, you used to be a reliable supporter, and now you're more than a little bit distracted by this nuclear program. You're not so useful. And this whole argument is put to bed not because they resolved their differences, but because a few weeks later, in January 2010, somebody slaps a magnetic sticky bomb on the car of an Iranian nuclear physicist named Professor Mohammadi as he goes to work on a Tehran morning and kills him. The Iranians not only lose this important nuclear physicist who's apparently working on their nuclear program, but the humiliation, the optics of their inability to protect key people at home sends them through the roof. And they call in Hezbollah, and they call in the Quds Force, and they say, enough, here's how it will be. They create a new unit in the Quds Force tasked specifically with assassinating diplomats from Western countries trying to undermine their nuclear program. You saw 3 plots targeting Israeli interests 2 Februaries ago within 24 hours. In Thailand, in the Republic of Georgia, in India. In West Africa, they targeted unsuccessfully British diplomats. In Baku, Azerbaijan, again, they came this close to blowing up, to targeting the American ambassador, other members of the U.S. embassy staff, and crossing an unwritten red line, members of their families as well. And that continues. Meanwhile, Hezbollah is told, do 2 things. The first thing you're going to do is stop. Just stop. Take off 6, 7, 8 months. Recruit the creme de la creme from your militia, the Islamic resistance, the Muqawama. Teach them the dark arts. Recruit people with foreign complexions, foreign languages, dual passports, dual nationalities. And when they're trained, and when you're ready, go assassinate Israeli tourists. They are softer targets. They're easier to hit. We want the Israelis to get a message now, soon, that targeting our nuclear program is no longer cost-free. Maybe deter them from doing more in the future. I know, said the Iranians, you want to hit senior Israeli officials to avenge Mughnir's death. Hitting tourists wouldn't satisfy that. It's fine. Continue along that path too. And these 2 plot lines continue, though not at the 100% operational tempo that they once did, because Hezbollah is so distracted by what's going on in Syria. They just don't have the bandwidth to do these international plot lines as forcefully as they once did, because they're so invested in Syria, and this investment in Syria is undermining their political standing at home in Lebanon so devastatingly. Now in the real world, unlike shows like Homeland, a minister probably like myself has a hard time watching them because it's so far removed from reality. Fun show. It's not the case where when groups like Hezbollah, which have tremendous tradecraft, stuff they get learning from the Iranians, the Ministry of Intelligence and Security in particular, it's not necessarily the case that when they exhibit great tradecraft they succeed, and when they make mistakes they fail. The only time Hezbollah succeeded in these plot lines targeting Israeli tourists was in Burgas, Bulgaria, with the Australian citizen and the 2 Canadian citizens, and they made huge mistakes, and yet they succeeded. The Israelis have said publicly they had telephone intercepts between very known bad people in Lebanon, Hezbollah, and unknown persons in Bulgaria, and they couldn't track it in time to figure out who it was, again, not like on television, And those call lines go dead on July 18th, the day of the bombing. But it's more than that. You can go online on my website or others, you can see the picture of the fake license that they made. Hezbollah has second to none counterfeit capabilities. Counterfeit money, counterfeit travel documents. This fake US Michigan driver's license is beautiful. The hologram, the whole bit of it, it's perfect, except for two things. First, the picture on the license is literally laughable. The guy's wearing an obvious wig with the hair going straight out. It's either something from a bad television sitcom comedy, or he just stuck a fork in an outlet and got zapped. You can't explain it. But far more strange, because maybe the forger, he's sitting there, he puts together this document, and someone comes in and says, "Sir, I have the picture for you," and he looks and he says, "Am I supposed to put this ridiculous-looking picture into this incredible false license? I'm sorry, it's all we have." So maybe that is not the forger's responsibility. But what is that this Michigan driver's license, Michigan, north central United States on the border with Canada, has an address in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, on the Gulf Coast, several hundred miles. It's like having a Melbourne driver's license with a Perth address. Unbelievable, and yet they succeeded. There were other mistakes. We originally thought it was a suicide bombing because one of the Canadian Lebanese went up with the bomb. We now know for a fact through technical analysis of the remains of the bomb that it was remotely detonated. It appears that one of the Israeli tourists had put his suitcase on the bus where he wanted it, and the bomber put his knapsack bomb on the bus. He moved over the suitcase to get it where he wanted it. The Israeli tourist apparently took umbrage. I put that suitcase where I wanted it, thank you very much. And they have an exchange of words, and the two operatives, the Australian and the other Canadian, and the two Canadians, we don't know the second guy's identity, but we know from DNA they're related, decide to set off the device remotely because they thought maybe the operation was undermined. And they succeeded. They killed 6 people, wounded a few dozen more, 5 Israelis, 1 Bulgarian, the Muslim bus driver. I've been to Bulgaria. I met with the equivalent of their AFP investigators responsible for the case, the director of their intelligence service, Minister of Interior. They're more than a little bit embarrassed about it, but the fact of the matter is that no one from the Bulgarian government attended the Bulgarian bus driver's funeral, despite the fact that he moved the bus at the last minute and likely saved lives, because he was Muslim, and they were afraid it was an inside job. In fact, the first part of any Bulgarian community to honor him was the local synagogue, which put up 6 candles, not 5. Compare that to a week and a half earlier, where Hussam Yaqub, a dual Lebanese-Swedish citizen, in fact the second Swedish Hezbollah operative to have been arrested within 6 months, Hussein Atris had already been arrested in Thailand. They both have since been convicted and are serving time in Thailand and in Cyprus, respectively. Hussam Yaqub, incredible tradecraft, and he's thwarted. It's not perfect tradecraft. Somehow the Israelis get wind of him and warn the Cypriots. The Cypriots wisely don't arrest him right away. They conduct a very nice surveillance operation, follow him from his hotel back to the airport, watch him conduct surveillance of Israelis getting off their chartered airplane and onto the buses. When they arrest him the next day, he first denies everything. The first example of his tradecraft is excellent R2I training, R2I, resistance to interrogation. Again, in the real world, it's not like on TV. You're not told never speak. There's no such thing as never speak. What you're taught, what you teach your military intelligence and we teach ours, is buy some time. And then when you start talking, don't say everything and weave a yarn together, some truth, some not truth. And then ultimately, if you come clean on everything, that's fine, but give us some time to wrap up whatever else may be going on and get back to safety. First few days, he denies everything. Then he says, okay, look, I'm Hezbollah, but Hezbollah is not a banned entity in Lebanon, and actually it's not a banned entity here in Cyprus. This is just before the European Union ban of Hezbollah's military and terrorist wings, as you've done here. But I didn't do any terrorism. And then he spins a yarn. He was recruited by some guy named Rami who randomly met him in the street at a falafel stand in Beirut. I have no idea why he approached me. A couple of days later he says, hey, remember I told you about some guy named Rami? He doesn't exist. And he tells the whole story. Not only do we know about his whole recruitment and training, we know about the other surveillance he did in the country. And you might ask, when was he recruited? Well, I just told you in January 2010, Iran told him to recruit people just like him. So you might say, probably January 2010 or shortly thereafter, and you'd be wrong. And then you might think, well, maybe it was February 2008 when Mugnir was assassinated. Shortly after that, maybe that's when he was recruited, and that'd be very logical, and you'd be wrong again. He was recruited more than a year earlier, before Mugnir was killed, in 2007. because he had a Swedish passport. His father still lived in Sweden. They sent him immediately back to Sweden via the UAE, not directly from Lebanon, just to renew the passport. And they trained him slowly, methodically, ideological training, small handguns, IED manufacture, and then they say, now it's time for your first operation. We're going to send you on a courier mission. You're going to go to the following corner of the following street, outside the following mall in Turkey. And you're going to look for a guy wearing the following clothing at the following time of day. And if you find him, you'll deliver this package without bringing attention to yourself. And if you don't, you'll go back the next day at a different prearranged time until eventually you make the drive. Very basic, simple, but real and effective tradecraft. Only it wasn't a real mission, it was a test, and they had someone following him to make sure he could do it properly. When he came back, they said, look, you did it great, it wasn't a real op, but it was a test, and you passed the test. A few more weeks of training, and they say, now it's the real courier mission, and they sent him to deliver stuff to and pick up packages from to Hezbollah operatives around the world. And you might ask, where do you think Hezbollah might have a need to make deliveries to its operatives? Maybe somewhere in the Middle East? Maybe the tri-border area of South America, where Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay meet, where we know Hezbollah has a long-standing network? Good guesses. You'd be wrong. How about Western Europe? How about Amsterdam? How about Lyon, France? He makes these trips, he comes home, and now they say, soon we're going to give you your real mission. And the real mission is, you're going to go to Cyprus. A lot. The first few times you're just a tourist, nothing else. You meet people, you make friends. You hang out with the bartender when he's done with his shift. You ask if you can go out and hang out with him and his friends. And you come again, and you come again, and you come again, and before you know it, you have a network. It's not like on television where you're going to do an operation, you go to the third sub-basement of CIA headquarters where they create a fake legend with fake documentation, and you guys sit there like a undergraduate studying for a test, memorizing what is my fake mother-in-law's maiden name. A real legend is you, with a new, clean Swedish passport that's really you. And a you that is just a guy that's known as someone who comes to Cyprus all the time for tourism and now for business. You say to your new made buddies, hey, I think there's a business opportunity here. I think I might export Lebanese juices to Cyprus and import Cypriot trinkets to Lebanon. Can you help me open a bank account? Do you know someone who could get me a storage facility? Ultimately, the Israelis find out about him, the Cypriots surveil him, they see him doing the surveillance. When he eventually comes clean and everything, he admits that he did surveillance in some of his earlier runs. He was asked with finding out information about two specific hotels. One he did surveil, the other couldn't, it was under renovation. He was asked to find out if there's kosher on the island. He had no idea what that meant. He looked it up and found out there's no kosher food in Cyprus. That either means Hezbollah really likes kosher cuisine, or they were looking for Jews. He was asked to find specific information about a particular parking lot. Can you park overnight? Is there an attendant? Do you leave your keys? Can you access your car 24/7? And that's disconcerting, because we know in at least 3 other operations, including one in 1994 in Bangkok, in your backyard, where Hezbollah came this close to blowing up the Israeli embassy. And the only reason they failed is not that you knew about it, not that we knew about it, not the Thais nor the Israelis, none of us knew about it. He just pulled out of the parking garage where he parked the car the night before, the car bomb, and pulled out into Bangkok morning rush hour traffic, and immediately got into a fender bender with one of those 3-wheel tut-tut taxis, and that disrupted the whole thing. But in that case, and in the 2 cases in Buenos Aires in 92 and 94, the bombing of the Israeli embassy and the Armenian Jewish community respectively, they parked their bomb in a car park. I can't believe I just said car park, that's how long I've been here, a garage, a car park, the night before the bombing. And so I told the Cypriots, if I were you, I'm not saying there's an operation here. Hezbollah does things off the shelf to prepare just in case all the time, but I'd draw a 2-mile radius about that, around that garage, that car park, and see what's there. Now the scariest thing is this. We know that Hezbollah does things off the shelf all the time. And so we weren't terribly concerned, though obviously we were concerned, when we found out, and you'll read the details in the book, that in 1999, a group of Hezbollah operatives here in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, talked around the table, shooting the breeze, nothing more than that. No evidence of any plot, no evidence of any operation, no evidence they did anything more about it, no evidence that they asked or briefed senior leaders about it, they just talked about it and dropped it. But they talked in 1999 about, hey, what do you think about doing something targeting the Jewish community in Australia next year, time to the Olympics? And I argue that it should give you no solace or comfort whatsoever that that's where it ended. Because we know that this is what they do all the time. Not because I told you so, but because Husam Yaqub, our Swedish operative in Cyprus, told that to investigators. In the last day of his interrogations, he tells Cypriot police, in an effort, and he's been doing this for a few days now, to explain, yes, I was Hezbollah, and yes, I was doing this surveillance, whatever, but that's not terrorism. That's Al-Qaeda. This is resistance. This is noble. He's trying to explain again that he's not a terrorist, despite that he's done, and he says, and I quote, he says, I told you I'm Hezbollah, yes, but this is not terrorism, he says, quote, I was just carrying out surveillance of the Jews. This is what my organization does all over the world, end quote. Not my words. That's his words. So we have a lot of things on the plate right now with Hezbollah. And given what's happening in Syria, it's just inflated them many times over. The vast majority of people you have from Australia who are going to fight in Syria are Sunnis. You'll note the case in Sydney this past week. I understand there'll be more like that. I understand you have about twice as many Sunnis who have gone to fight in Syria already today than the total number of people who went to fight in Afghanistan during the Afghan jihad from Australia. This is a trend and the basic proportional dynamics we're seeing around the world. But there are a small number of people who've gone from here to fight for Hezbollah too. And that means we have to be more on top of this than ever before, because Syria is radicalizing the extremists on both the Sunni and the Shia sides of the equation like never before. In fact, we don't only have to worry about the terrorism issue, we have to worry about hate crimes. And I'm not talking necessarily just about hate crimes targeting the Jewish community. You have already had, and you will have more hate crimes between the Sunni and Shia communities here in Australia, as we've already seen in the United States as well. Hezbollah is many things in Lebanon. It's a political party, it's a social welfare movement, it's a militia, it's all those things. Anybody who tells you it's not is lying to you. But it's also an international terrorist group and an international organized criminal enterprise. And if you can't understand that, you can't understand the organization overall. Now, you might have heard that there are negotiations going on in Geneva to try and resolve the Iranian nuclear program. I have some concerns about that. My concern is not that there are negotiations. Negotiations and diplomacy, these are not four-letter words. The Israelis themselves have said a good deal would be a good deal. The problem is anything less than an actually good deal is a horrific deal. There's no such thing as an almost, nearly there, pretty close deal. And even if pink ponies prance in the prairies and there's peace among mankind and it all goes swimmingly, as President Rouhani himself has said, we are negotiating only this one file. Parenthetically, what a brilliant political way to put it. His people hear this one file, they hear the economy. We hear this one file, we hear the nuclear program. But he's making clear we understand this has nothing to do with Iran's human rights abuses at home. This has nothing to do with Iran's activities in Syria. It has nothing to do with Iran's support for terrorism, which will not end because Iran sees its support for terrorism as a legitimate means of expressing its foreign policy, trying to achieve its foreign policy goals, one that is no more and no less legitimate than anything else. Understand this, they're not Al-Qaeda. They're not nihilistic. They're not looking to do violence anytime for any reason, but if violence will get them what they want, better or easier than something else, then fine. No more, no less legitimate than asking nicely. Listen to this. I'm quoting to you now from a declassified CIA report. Although the president of Iran has sought to improve relations with some Western nations since directly assuming the presidency, events of the past year prove that Tehran continues to view the selective use of terrorism as a legitimate tool. Iranian terrorist attacks targeting enemies of the regime over the previous year were probably approved in advance by the president and other senior leaders, but the planning and implementation of these operations are probably managed by other senior officials, most of whom are the president's appointees or allies. The president or the supreme leader would closely monitor and approve planning for any potential attack against U.S. or Western interests. This could have been written yesterday. It was written in August 1990. Reporting on one of the original, quote-unquote, moderate Iranian presidents. People refer to President Khatami as a moderate, President Rafsanjani as a moderate, at least until he made his public famous statement saying that he thought Iran should have a nuclear program and that they should use it to wipe Israel off the map. Everybody knows there was some official who said it was Rafsanjani. And I ask you, by the way, does anybody know who the previous president in Iran was, compared to whom even Rafsanjani appeared to be moderate? The man who is today the supreme leader of Iran, and who's not moderated since then, not one bit. I don't hold out great hope for this deal. I think this deal, we don't call it an interim deal, we call it a joint action plan, is deeply flawed, mostly because it allows Iran to continue enriching up to 5% as much as it wants. They can't turn on new, but they can have as many centrifuges as they already have running. They have to shut down not one. And 20% uranium, it's a nice number, it's irrelevant. The only number that matters is 3.5. 60% of the process is getting to 3.5. From 3.5 to 20, from 20 to 90%, that's easy. That's easy. The fact that they have to deplete their 20% stockpile means nothing if they're allowed to enrich as much 3.5 as they want. There are a whole bunch of other flaws in this deal. My biggest fear is that it will not just be a 6-month negotiation that either succeeds or fails. And let me be clear again, I would love for it to succeed with a truly good deal where Iran is no longer enriching uranium. But it has a clause in there for mutually agreed upon extensions, which means Iran just has to dangle a carrot, a big enough carrot, close enough to the Western nose, so that at day 5 months and 30 days, we have a hard time walking away. And this is my fear, that we will not be able to walk away from a not good deal. Because for feeling that we have a pretty good deal, and if we continue, we might get a good deal. And that's a problem. Because when you're negotiating, I happen to have a graduate degree in negotiation theory. When you're negotiating with someone, and they don't think you're going to be able to walk away, and under any circumstances, they've got you over a barrel.